This is my last session with you guys, and so I do want to thank Jed and the Within Reach team for inviting me to come here. I've had lots of people from Omaha say to me that it's not normally this cold here in Omaha, but whenever I go to Seattle, they always tell me it's not this wet here in Seattle, or if I go to Alabama, they tell me it's not this hot here in Alabama. So I'm never in the city when it's just right, seems to me. But I'm afraid I'm going to leave in the morning, so I'm not really going to kind of get to know much about Omaha very much at all, which is disappointing to me, because I will go home and people will say, "Oh, Omaha, what's that like?" And I'll be like, "Well, I could describe this church building to you. And my hotel room, but that's about it," which is not ideal. But I do want to thank you for your hospitality. I mean, I didn't really know what people in Nebraska would be like. I know people in the South are super hospitable and ultra friendly, and people in the North are different from that. But I wasn't sure about the ones in the middle. But you guys, you're a little bit more like the South, I think. There's been lots of affirmations and introductions, so thank you for being a nice soft landing for me. I really appreciate it. I want to finish by talking about our contribution to engaging with the city, and I'm going to do that around a series of words, all of which start with the same letter. Just in case you're wondering whether I'm actually a real preacher and I can do that, I'm just going to show you that I can. We teach a course on engagement in our cities, and one of the things we do is look at these 5 P's of missional incarnational engagement. So I'm going to launch straight into those 5 P's. The first one is proximity. For us to engage with our city, we have to foster in our congregations and among the Christian community a strong devotion to a commitment to proximity to the city, engagement in the life and the rhythms and the culture of the city. And I recognize that particularly as a result of the holiness tradition and some of our other traditions in the kind of Protestant church, white Protestant church in particular, we have had a real come out kind of culture built into us, a kind of a separation from the city, a kind of get out of the world and into the church. Here is where the people of God are. You're here, you're safe, you're nurtured, you're cared for. Okay, hold your nose now. Out you go into the world. I hope you cope for the rest of the week. We'll see you on Wednesday night at Bible study, which is not a very missional spirituality, right? In fact, I think we need to reverse this idea. We follow a God who took on flesh and dwelt among us. Like incarnation, the incarnation, ought to be our kind of primary motif for thinking about mission, right? When Jesus said to his followers, "Just as the Father sent me, so I send you," he wasn't simply talking about them being sent. He was describing the way in which they were to be sent, the same way I was, says God. Though perfect, though God, I've taken on flesh and dwelt among you. I've entered into life. That ought to be the kind of primary framework for thinking about what Christian mission is like. Not come ye out and be ye separate, but to be sent out into the world to foster deep relationships and close proximity to the city of which we're part. I remember many years ago now, during the whole emerging church kind of movement. Does anyone remember the emerging church? I went to an emerging church conference, and they did this extraordinary thing. The conference was in a center like this, and they said our closing session is going to be a communion session. We're going to share the Lord's Supper together, but not here. We're going to go to a downtown church. It was within walking distance, so there were directions: go out here, turn left, turn right, walk so many meters, and go to Saint something or other's church. It was a big, old, beautiful Anglican church in the middle of the city. We'll reconvene there at a certain time where we'll share Holy Communion. And so everyone's chit-chatting, and just as happens after a session like this, we all walked down in droves down to this church down the street, and it was pretty casual and, as I said, very conversational. But when you walked into the church, we were all stopped in our tracks. Because even though this was a grand, high-ceilinged church with stained glass windows, a very traditional-looking church building, They had removed every stick of furniture from the building. There were no pews, there was no pulpit, there was no communion tables, there was nothing. It was completely bare. And the floor from wall to wall was covered in black plastic. And in the middle of the room was a mountain, like a huge pile of household rubbish. Like they'd collected it from the local tip and brought it in a truck and backed it into the church building. It was like, I'm not talking about hard rubbish. I'm talking about food scraps and milk bottles and like fish bones and meat bones. And there was like little rivers of garbage juice running out from this mountain. So that when you walked in, of course, you were hit by the smell. And then you were stunned to see this kind of rotting pile of refuse in the middle of this beautiful sanctuary. And so when you walked in, you were silent. You kind of fanned out around this pile, which was right in the middle of the room, and dodging the garbage juice, and just stood there mute. And then two guys came out from the two doors either side of the platform, and they were wearing kind of like monks' cassocks, I guess you'd say, like robes. And they walked out and they said, "Welcome to this Eucharist service. We come to gather now to eat and drink in Jesus' name." And there were screens up around the room, and so we were led through a cappella singing and responsive readings, preparing us for the experience of taking communion. I was having trouble focusing, my friends, because I was just thinking, why is there a pile of garbage in the middle of the room? Because no mention was made of this pile of garbage. It was just like literally the elephant in the room. We're all thinking, could you get to the point where this garbage makes sense to us? And sure enough, there came that point. They said, now we gather together to break bread and to drink wine, to remember Jesus' sacrifice and his love for us. They said, as we do this, we don't simply remember his atoning sacrifice on the cross. We do, but not only that. We don't only celebrate that he defeats death in the resurrection. We do, but more than that. We don't only celebrate the fact that he's ascended to the Father and that there's a piece of earth in heaven, just as he has sent his Holy Spirit a piece of heaven to be on earth. We do that, but more. In this feast, we also celebrate the most astonishing miracle of all, the incarnation. Every miracle before it points toward it, and every miracle since proceeds from it. And with that, they removed their robes. They were just wearing boxers. And they walked over to the pile of garbage and they waded into it until they're up to their thighs in rotting refuse. And then one of them reached down into the garbage and pulled out a bottle of wine. And the other reached down into the garbage and pulled out a loaf of bread, thankfully wrapped in plastic. And they said, if you choose to eat this bread and to drink this wine, we want you to do so hearing the words of the Master who said, as the Father sent me, so I send you. The Eucharist is not only a celebration of what has been, it is also a recommissioning to us every time we take it for what will be. And so if you choose to take communion this day, remove your shoes, hoist up your skirt or your dress, or roll up the legs of your pants, and know that you're wading into this garbage to receive these elements is your way of saying, send me. Now, folks, I've taken communion many, many times. I'll be honest with you, sometimes without thinking much about it. But when you have to consider whether to wade into a mountain of garbage, and whether you have to consider whether you can legitimately say by your actions, just as you were sent, King Jesus, into the filth and the brokenness and the shit and the piss and the pain and the darkness of this world. Send me. My friends, that's what Holy Communion should be every time we eat and drink. Don't you agree? It's a recommissioning. You did this. I follow you in this into the world in which you've placed me. I mean, it's not like there are some of us who are missional and others who can kind of not be. Every Christian ought to be able to answer this question. To whom have you been sent? That could be my work colleagues, that could be my neighbours, that could be my city, that could be my nation. But to whom have you been sent? You know, Benny, that's the prisons, right? It's like, you know, we heard his testimony before. It's like, I know where I've been sent. I can tell you the prisons I'm sent to. I'm there all the time. Like, you meet a man like Benny and you know he has a very clear sense of where I've been sent. I'm wading into that place. I heard Tracy before about her work in schools. To whom have you been sent? We know where she's sent. She can tell us where she's sent. She can take us there. We can meet the principals of the schools and the business leaders she's engaging with. All of us. Now, here's the point, folks. It's not good enough that that just happens to be like for clergy or for people like Tracy or Benny. Every Christian ought to be able to say that. It doesn't necessarily mean that they run a Christian organisation or a Christian ministry of some kind, but they ought to see the city, or at least some section of it, or at least some group of it, as the context to which they have been called to go, to be sent as Christ sent them. And folks, I'm afraid to tell you this, lots of people don't have that sense. And sometimes clergy don't get it, because clergy do feel sent. You felt sent to theological college or seminary, and from there you felt sent to the church that you're part of now, or you've been sent to various places. It's part of your DNA, you're a sent person. That's just how you think. But I want you to recognize, I've heard so many people in churches say to me, I wish I was sent somewhere. I wish I had a sense of where I'm sent. And very often what they hear from churches about their contribution to the kingdom is about how they can serve in the church. Very often it's like you're a sent one. You were sent to St. Bartholomew's. You could be on the parking roster, or you could be on the finance team, or you could be part of the creche ministry. All of those things are fine, they're great. But I wouldn't count that as sentness, because that's in the family. I would say you need to reduce people's expectations on volunteerism in the church and increase expectations on the people to whom they've been sent in this world. And good pastors should actually tap people on the shoulder and say, you're on this committee and you're running that group and you're part of the youth ministry and you're playing in the band. That's too much. Lose two of those things. Do two of them, lose two of them, and go recognise your sense of calling or sentness. Make proximity in the life of the congregation. I know none of you pastors are going to do that, but I can still say that's what I think that you should do. Because it's not about like, okay, take time off and do nothing. It's like take time off and host people in your home. Take time off and go and volunteer in a city program. Take time off and go join a walking club. Take time off and go hang out at show choir. I only just found out what show choir is, by the way. It sounds utterly dreadful to me, but anyway, it could be your deal. Go join it. Get involved in it. Do it. Proximity is absolutely essential. When I was a pastor of a church, we used to have various requirements that we would expect church members to contribute to. I know you have expectations placed on members of your churches. Generally, you expect them to come on Sundays, you expect them to tithe or contribute financially, you expect them to pray, read their Bibles. I don't know. You must have these expectations. I know there's not a set of laws on a plaque somewhere. I know it's not legalistic, but you expect certain behaviour from your church. So we used to say, we don't expect you to come every Sunday. We don't expect you to give us all your money. Here's what we do expect you to do. We want you to bless 3 people every week. And we want you to eat with 3 people every week. And people would say, eat with 3 people every week? I mean, that's a lot. It's like, well, you eat 3 times a day, right? Americans more, but, you know, lots of people eat 3 times a day. I'm not asking you to add any more meals, just bring some people to the table. Just say, 3 times a week I'm going to be eating with somebody other than members of my family. It could be a work colleague. Hey, join me in the lunchroom. It could be, we don't care, coffee and a donut, on the way to work. It could be whatever, like beer and crisps after work. Like just sit across the table, put something in your mouth and talk. At least 3 times a week. Bless people at least 3 times a week. What's a blessing? A gift, an act of kindness, words of affirmation. And what we would do is every week we would encourage people, get up on Monday morning and pray your heart out and say, God, who do you want me to bless this week? God, who do you want me to eat with this week? And here's the thing, if I could, in some Obi-Wan Kenobi kind of way, come into your church and just say, you will bless 3 people every week. You will eat with 3 people every week. And they would be like, we will bless 3 people every week. If I could just make everyone in your church do that, just like that, it would turn your church inside out. Because blessing and eating are reciprocal activities. When people get invited to eat a meal with somebody, they're always thinking, how can I invite them back? Or when someone receives a word of affirmation or a gift, they're thinking, how can I return the favor in some way? And it starts to ricochet around the city. You do it however you do it, but you need to foster within members of your congregation a high level of commitment to proximity with the city. You can't do the whole city. You just do the portion that you feel that God has called you to do, to see yourself as sent to your football team, as sent to your community group, as sent to your neighborhood, and to see all of your engagements as wading into that world, just as the Father sent the Son. Does this make sense? I'll tell you a funny story about this, because years ago I was in this church where we were blessing 3 people, eating with 3 people, and we had a number of other rhythms that we lived out, but I'll just leave it at those 2. And I was in this pub, and this guy comes over to me, and we just get chatting. He comes over to order a drink, and we're just next to each other, so we get chatting. And he says, I don't know how this came up. I think I'd just come back from America, and I'd been to Georgia. So he says, one of my favorite writers is from Georgia. Who's that? He said, Flannery O'Connor. You haven't heard of her. He said, no one's ever heard of Flannery O'Connor in Australia. She's not very well known. I said, I've heard of Flannery O'Connor. In fact, I love Flannery O'Connor. I've read just about everything she ever wrote. I've actually been to her childhood home in Savannah. Like, I'm a huge fan of Flannery O'Connor. He says, are you kidding? I am too. Have you read the story about, yeah. Have you read the story about, yeah. So this is a very weird conversation for 2 Aussie blokes to have at a pub, talking about Flannery O'Connor's short stories. That seemed random to me. So I thought maybe the Lord's got something in store here. I happened to be in our local book exchange. I saw a copy, a bit of a battered old copy of the collected works of Flannery O'Connor. The Lord is in this, right? Like, this is clear, obvious. So I buy it, it's cheap, I buy it, it's put in my satchel. I carried it around a few times. I was in that same pub sometime later. This guy is there, so I go over to him. I said, do you remember me? We were talking about Flannery O'Connor. Of course, he said. How could I forget? Like, have you ever met anyone who likes Flannery O'Connor? Well, I said, I found this old copy of Flannery O'Connor's collected works, so I bought it for you. Now, in Australia, I don't know what it's like in Nebraska, but in Australia, where a man buys a book for another man that he hardly knows, that's considered to be skating over the limits of appropriate intimacy. So he was somewhat taken aback. And then I said, and I wrote a little inscription in the front for him. I was wanting to bless him, right? I've got to bless 3 people every week. So I bought him the book, and I thought, words of affirmation. You know, you're a really sensitive, intuitive man, or something like that. I mean, seriously, this is what I wrote. It's like, if you love Flannery, you must be like a really, really smart, interesting kind of person. I wrote this to him. So I said, I wrote something for you. And he reads it. Oh, thanks, man. That's really nice. And then I was certain, whenever I was in a social setting with him, he moved to the furthest part of the room away from me. So I was like, yeah. I travel around the world teaching about proximity, and I suck at it. This is stupid. One day, same pub, sitting around with a bunch of guys, and someone says to me, Mike, you're part of Small Boat Big Sea, aren't you? That was the name of our church. I know you've got great names here, Relevant, Collective. Ours was Small Boat Big Sea. You're part of Small Boat Big Sea, aren't you? And I was like, yeah, I helped to found it. Right, he said, what is that? I haven't been able to figure it out. Is it a church? And we always trained ourselves to deny that. So I said, no, we're not a church. We're just a collective of people who are orienting our lives around Jesus. Another word for that would be, we're just a collective of people who orient our lives around Jesus. Oh, well, what do you do? And I thought that was a really good question, because I guess if I'd said, yeah, we're a church, he wouldn't have asked, what do you do? I mean, he wouldn't have known, but he still would have figured he did. But when you're a collective of people who orient your lives around Jesus, it's like, what do you do? And I thought, what do we do? Oh, I said, I know what we do. We bless 3 people every week. We eat with 3 people every week. We listen to the Holy Spirit. We learn Jesus. We're sent into the world. The guy I bought the book for was there. He says, is that what you were doing when you bought the book for me? Oh, man, I said, I am so glad you raised this, because I know it's been really awkward, and I know when you got the book, you thought that I was in love with you, but no, I was just, it's a blessing. That's what we do. We've trained each other to bless people, acts of kindness, words of affirmation, gifts, and I probably went too far, and that didn't work, and I'm sorry, but yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Oh, he said, no, you didn't, no, don't apologize. He said, in fact, and he pulled out his wallet, and he pulled out of the wallet, unfolded it, the front page with my blessing on it, which he'd torn out of the book and folded up and carried with him. And I said, wow, so are you in love with me? And he said, you probably don't know this, he said, but I was going through a really terrible divorce. I was an asshole. I realise that now. Things were really nasty. No one was talking to me. My friends were all siding with my wife, now ex-wife. I felt miserable. I went into therapy. Honestly, I just felt like there was nothing good about me at all. And this therapist says, well, maybe there is work you need to do on yourself. But I'm sure some people have seen something good in you. No, he said, no one's seen anything good in me. Well, I'm surely someone has noticed something good about you. No, actually, this random guy wrote this blessing for me about how, she said, carry that book with you as a reminder that people can still see the good in you. And he said to me, Mike, he said, that book was 500 pages long. He said, I couldn't carry, so I just ripped out that page. I've been carrying my wallet ever since. You have no idea what difference some of your blessings make. Can I tell you about his baptism as well? It was really funny. He says to me, I want to live the way you guys live. And I said, well, you've got to bless 3 people, eat with 3 people, listen to the Holy Spirit, learn Jesus, and be sent. And he started doing it. And slowly but surely, by living like a missional Christian, he became a Christian. Well, this is not the strategy, but this is how it worked out. When we baptized him, for him, Jesus just snuck up on him. He wasn't searching, he wasn't looking, he wasn't on a spiritual quest. God just pulled the rug out from under him, and next thing you know, he's a Christian. So when we baptized him, I said, now before we baptize you, normally it's appropriate for you now to say something, to confess your own faith to us. Would you like to say something? He said, yep. He said, I know what normally happens. I've been to these baptisms before. People usually, they say something like, oh, I was lost and my life was terrible and now I'm found, and oh, joy, I'm a Christian. He said, but I woke up one day and Jesus just kind of hijacked me, and I thought, oh shit, I'm a Christian. I went, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Sometimes people need to learn to live like Jesus before they find faith in Jesus. And for some people, they need to find faith in Jesus before they'd be interested in living like Jesus. I've discovered there's no one single route to coming to faith. Foster proximity. Second, foster presence. Not simply that we're good neighbours. It's not simply that we're involved in local groups, that we're contributing to society. Proximity is one thing. Putting ourselves in a situation where life rubs up against life, where we are seen to be the sort of person who actually is engaged meaningfully, relationally with people in our city. But secondly, also practice the presence of God in that place. There ought to be a sense in which people in the midst of all of that don't just think that you're a good neighbour. I mean, I hope that they do think that. But they also think that there's something intriguing or unlikely or beautiful, something spiritual about you. And the way we manage that, I think your churches are probably onto this, is to encourage people into a journey of discipleship which includes openness to the power of the Holy Spirit, the presence of the Spirit dwelling in their lives, listening to the Spirit's promptings and responding to them. We have to believe that God is at work in our city. We have to believe that God has sent us into this world to have meaningful proximity with people, and we have to be the kind of people that don't look like all their other neighbours. It's not to say we should be perfect, whatever that looks like, but rather we ought to model what it looks like to be a non-anxious presence, what it looks like to be full of peace, what it looks like to be unafraid. We're living in the most polarised and terrified time in our history, at least for a long, long time. Anxiety, a lack of resilience, fear, uncertainty about the future. When they meet people with a deep sense of the presence of God, confident that He has the future in hand, unafraid of differing opinions or people with different views or different coloured skin or different culture, curious people, confident, resilient people. There's something intriguing about that. So practice the presence of God in your life in place. Part of a problem with our spirituality in the evangelical church in particular is we've fostered, as I said before, a spirituality of separation. We have to come out of the world to go on a spiritual retreat somewhere. We have to come out of the world in order to have fellowship with Christians. We need to come out of the world in order to have a time of prayer or ministry. Those coming out times are great. But I want you to help your congregations to see what it looks like for us to dare to believe we do the work of God every day in our contexts, that God is present with us always, to foster a spirituality of engagement, that when I am serving or giving or feeding or loving or listening, that actually I'm doing the work of God. It's not God, not me being drained of something, but rather it's me being filled with something as a result of me fulfilling my vocation as a missional person. And thirdly, passion. Now I know Americans use the word passion just to mean enthusiasm for something, but the term passion originally meant something you were so obsessed by you'd be willing to die for it. We need to recover this idea, not that I'm so passionate about my faith that I would die for it, that would be good, but I don't think you're in danger of that just yet, but that I love my neighbours so much I'd be willing to die for them. Could you imagine if your city was full of people like that? Do you remember I told you the story of Abraham Hang, who brought about the kind of regeneration and renewal of Andong Resettlement Village out there in the middle of swampland? The postscript to that story was that once he had dried out that land and built a whole community on there, with schools and medical facilities and churches and what have you, he was called into the office of the local governor, and it's a very corrupt system in Cambodia. This local governor was like a local warlord almost. And he said to Abraham, "Thank you for drying out that land. That land is now arable and therefore sellable, and so we are going to repatriate them again. We're going to come with military lorries or trucks and we're going to move them further away. But we've had a lot of opposition to the way we've been doing that lately, and I don't want any kind of bad press or anything like that. So could you go back to your community and just warn them, just prepare them, just kind of be like a really calming influence on them so that when the trucks come, they'll be ready to be loaded onto them. And Abraham told me that he sat in this office opposite this guy with a military uniform on, and he said to the guy, well, Cambodia is very flat, and we will be able to see that convoy of trucks come from a long way off. And when we see it come, it's got to drive through these rice paddies and then out onto that kind of muddy road toward Andong. So I just want to promise you as a man of God, I will meet you in the middle of that road. And you will have to run me over to take my people away. Now, do you love your neighborhood that much? Could you imagine? I mean, I can't imagine that any such scenario would ever happen for you, but could you say, I love the people of South Omaha so much, I would die for them. I feel so called to the school community around such and such a school, I would die for them. Could you say that? I think, it won't come to that, I realize, but I think we need to get to the point where we have such a deep devotion to the people to whom we've been sent. Not just our church folks, but to the neighborhood to which we've been sent, to the city to which we've been sent. You would have to run me down in order to do them harm. That governor then said to him, all right, how much money would it take for you to go quietly? And then in the end, here's what they offered him. A whole stack of cash, and they said, we will build you a 3 or 4 story, fully air-conditioned church facility anywhere in Phnom Penh. I said to him, Abraham, you know there's a devil when he's offering people air-conditioned churches to walk away from the people to whom God has sent them. Proximity, presence, passion. The fourth one is prevenience. This is a Methodist idea. I don't know if any Methodists in the room or not, but this is a beautiful Methodist idea, and which goes like this, that God is at work among the people to whom you've been sent before you get there or any Christian witness arrives there. You probably experienced prevenience in your own life before you became a Christian, unless you were raised in the church and what have you. But for many of us, when we look back over our lives and why we became Christians, why we love the Lord, there was a whole choreography of life experience that led us to a point that readied us for the moment when someone came and talked to us about Jesus. Is this your experience? They could have been tragedies or joys or difficulties or serendipitous moments, as some people call them, or coincidences. This series of things occurred. And when you came to the point where somebody inaugurated Christian ministry for you, you were ripe, you were ready for it. Well, I want to suggest to you that that's the case in our city, that God is at work in Omaha, that God is choreographing the culture, that there is an openness, a yearning for certain things that only the gospel can respond to, that there is a hope or a desire for certain things that Jesus spoke about. There may not be a desire to join your church, there might not be a desire to become a Christian, but there's a hunger and a yearning and an openness. God is choreographing this city. And when we go into various contexts, trusting in God's hand, having been at work before we got there, it fills us with an openness to all the possibilities for mission that we might not otherwise have thought of. I don't know if you have this experience, those of you who are clergy, but whenever I meet somebody new and they ask me what I do for a job, I used to say I'm a professor. Oh, what do you teach? And I tell them I teach this and that and the other thing. Now I often just say I'm an ordained Baptist minister. It's like right out there. And I've often had lots of people go, whoa, you are an ordained Baptist minister. Right, okay, that's interesting. And then they give you their religious pedigree. Do you have this happen in America where it's like, Baptist, right, I don't know any Baptist, but I think my second cousin's next door neighbour's third son married a woman who was the daughter of a Methodist minister. And I'm like, well, that makes us very similar then in that case. And then as you get talking about things about faith or God or church or whatever it might be, usually an Australian will put their foot on the brake and say at a certain point, but I'm not religious myself, just in case you thought, I'm not religious. And my standard response is to say to them, so you've never had a religious experience? Now, I've only had 2 people say to me, no, never, nothing. Everyone else I've asked that to has said, oh, no, I wouldn't say that. Well, tell me about one, I say. I had a woman say to me when I gave birth to my first child and they brought her up and they put her at my breast, I looked at her and I thought, oh, surely life doesn't come from within me. That's a religious experience. I've had people say when I sit on my board waiting for another set of waves to come in off the South Pacific and I feel the surge of the ocean underneath me, I feel like, hey. Well, that's a spiritual experience. I've had people say to me, oh, I went to a Buddhist ashram in Nepal, or I took a course in this, or I practiced Tai Chi or yoga. I'm astonished. When you say, so you've never had a religious experience, most people have. And then when I ask them why would they call that religious, you start to explore that even further. You start to see all manner of ways in which God has prepared this person for this moment. Trusting in the prevenient grace of God actually not only inspires us to believe in the magnificence of God, but it actually invites deeper connection and relationship with the people with whom we're speaking. Only one Australian has ever won a Nobel Prize for Literature. I don't expect you to know who he was. But as soon as I say his name, you'll be like, oh, of course. No, you won't. His name is Patrick White, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1979, I think. He was particularly known in Britain and Australia in the post-war kind of era. He was a really extraordinary man in lots of respects. In the 1950s, he was openly gay, living with his partner in a kind of de facto married relationship, incredibly scandalous in Australia at that time. He was a very tall, very big man. He was rather bombastic. He had very strong opinions about things. He comes off, I never met him, but he comes off as a pretty arrogant, sort of sanctimonious kind of guy. And of course, he was writing best-selling novels. And then finally, to cap it all off, he wins the Nobel Prize. And so toward the end of his life, he, I imagine, thought of himself as being pretty special. An avowed and open critic of the church and an atheist. He wrote an autobiography and I read it and I came across this story. Most of the book is about how magnificent he is, but then I come across this story. He was living in a little farm near where Hillsong Church is today, then it was farmland, with his partner Manly, and he said it had been raining for days and days. It was really wet and muddy. He said, I had to feed the dogs that lived in the shed down the bottom of the property, or stayed in the shed, the bottom of the property. So he said, I put on my raincoat and my boots. I loaded up all these bowls full of dog food, put them on a tray, lifted the tray up. I backed out the screen door, and then I was walking down the flagstones to the shed at the bottom of the property. And he said, it was wet, it was very slippery, and so both feet go out from under me. He says, it's like I flew up into the sky, I landed on my tailbone. It was excruciating. I was in pain as I lay there. He said, bowls of dog food landed all over me. I'm lying in the mud, dripping wet, in pain, covered in dog food, and I look up and it's like this blackened sky. And he says they were teardrops as big as babies' fists pounding down on me. And he said, in that moment, I'm sure I heard a voice say, who the heck do you think you are? And then I just started to laugh at myself. He says he rolls over onto all fours, crawled into the house, pulled himself up onto the kitchen bench, and he said to his partner, Manly, this Sunday I have to go to church. When he got to church with his partner sitting in the back row, the Anglican rector was giving the announcements, and he mentioned that at the county fair the day before, he had seen a number of the members of his parish entering in the jelly bean guessing competition. And as that constituted gambling, they needed to repent before they could come and receive Holy Communion. And in his autobiography, Patrick White says this: "In that moment, I realised that whatever faith I might have had, it needed to remain an entirely private matter." Don't you find that heartbreaking? God went to the trouble of pulling the rug out from under this guy. God whispered into his consciousness. This is prevenient grace, friends. It triggered something in him that he thought he could only find the answer to it in church. And then we let him down. But imagine if you were his friend and you'd built proximity and you'd been in the presence of God in that context. What if you had a real passion for him, that you loved him so much you'd be willing to die for him? What would happen if he went to the pub on Thursday night and you're playing darts with him and he says to you, "I know you're a religious kind of guy," he says, "Can I tell you something weird that happened to me the other day?" Imagine if you were there to interpret his experience, to describe and explain the God that had whispered in his ear. This is the power of prevenience. God is doing this all the time. And we're worried about the people entering the jelly bean guessing competition. Proximity, presence, passion, prevenience, and the last one is proclamation. I already mentioned my kind of idea of proclamation happening like on this spectrum, from announcement at one end to demonstration at the other. But I just want to encourage us to see ourselves as being called to the city, but also to speak into the city in the name of Jesus and about Jesus. So it's not just that we're good citizens, which would be a worthy thing to be in any case, but we also see it as an opportunity for us to be able to allow people to see and to meet the one who has made sense of our lives, given us hope and purpose, made us the kind of people that we are, and who has sent us into the world in which we find ourselves. Proclamation is a big word because it sort of sounds like preaching, doesn't it? But to me, preaching, speaking, these are tools. Use whatever tool you can to do the real work, which is help people to develop a vision of and a picture of who Jesus is. I teach a unit at the seminary where I teach called Jesus and the Gospels. I'm not a New Testament scholar. I'm actually a missiologist, and I run the missiology department. But they get me to teach this entry-level first-year unit called Jesus and the Gospels. It's basically just an introduction to the Synoptic Gospels. And nearly every year, students in that class will say to me, "I think I might have become a Christian in this class." And I say to them, "No, you didn't. You had to show us you were a Christian before you got into this class. But you probably met more of Jesus than you had for a long time." I don't know if this is an issue in America, but it astonishes me. What are churches teaching people if they're not teaching Jesus? If we don't have churches full of people who know everything there is to know about Jesus, what's happening? If Jesus is just the key, that he died for me so that I can go to heaven, if that's all they know about Jesus, I often say most people just know Jesus' greatest hits: Christmas, Easter, a few miracles, a few parables. But do you know all of it? Can you just tell me everything you know about Jesus? Does it just flow out of you? We have generations of Christians who aren't very good at this, who encounter him as if it were for the first time when they go to seminary. It ought to be Christianity 101. You ought to have exams. You ought to have assessments. You want to prove to me, what did you learn this year about Jesus? It always astonishes me that pastors are regularly saying, I really feel like God's called me as a teacher. And I say, well, how do you know that anyone's learned anything? Because I am a teacher and I have to prove at the end of every semester that my students learned something. We have congregations of churches where it's are they learning anything? Do they know more about Jesus this year than they did last year? I went to speak at a conference of a group called Christian Surfers. These are people who work around on beaches around Australia. They love surfing. They hang out with other surfers, and it's an incarnational mission to surfers. And I rate them. I think they're great. I'm going to tell a story that might be a little bit against them, but I want you to know I rate them totally. They're a great evangelistic organisation. But I was asked to speak at one of their staff meetings, and I was illustrating this point. To what degree are we good at proclaiming Jesus and knowing Jesus? And so I said to them, let's do a little exercise. Tell me, who's the greatest surfer of all time? Now, when you ask a room full of surfers to identify the greatest surfer that has ever lived, do you know what happens? The room erupts. People are naming names, criticising the names other people have named. They're just yelling names at me left and right. And so okay, let's take, just take, for case of the argument, let's just take Kelly Slater. He's only won the world title 11 times or something. He's still surfing and he's nearly 50 or something. Let's just take Kelly Slater as our example. You may not agree he's the greatest ever, but let's just take Kelly Slater as our example. Tell me now, what do you guys know about Kelly Slater? The room was completely chaotic. There are people listing each year he won the world title, and they got 1 year wrong, and the whole room went ballistic. There are people telling me what beach he grew up on, where he lives now, which movie stars he's dated, what board he rides now, what board he learned to ride. People are just full of Kelly Slater. The room was Kelly slated. It was everywhere. It took ages to calm them down. Surfers are excitable anyway. Later on, I'm talking about the need for us to be able to proclaim the gospel, to speak about Jesus, to talk about who he is and what he means to us. And so I said to them, so, tell me, what do you know about Jesus? It's the same question I asked about Kelly Slater. Crickets. No, I said, come on, now what do you know about Jesus? He's the Son of God. Good, what else? He died for our sins. Good, what else? He ushered in the kingdom of God. Yeah, good. It took forever. Now, I'm not saying they don't know Jesus or don't love Jesus, but here's what I want us to get to, folks, is a point where we build proximity. We evidence the presence of God in the city. We are passionate about the call that God placed on our lives. We're looking for all the ways that God's prevenient grace is at work, and that we could talk about Jesus the way surfers talk about Kelly Slater. For it to full of quotes, full of stories, full of energy and passion and love. Because it seems to me as though lots of people in your country are over church, and they're over religion, and they're over kind of conservative values. But they're not over Jesus, have you noticed? They're desperate to find somebody who is as passionate about him as surfers are of Kelly Slater. Or my friend who's a huge fan of Leon Trotsky and can quote him at the drop of a hat. It's almost become a joke. It's oh, did Leon Trotsky say anything about this? Well, and he'll tell us something. Be that person, the Jesus person in your city. That will distinguish us from being any other community group committed to the flourishing of the city. We'll be the Jesus people committed to the flourishing of the city. I don't know much about Omaha. I'll keep my eye on it though. I'd love to see what happens as a result of these networks and these connections that you guys are building. I don't think you can change a city with one church committed to it, or a handful of people committed to it, or a single mayor, or a single police chief, or a single school principal doing it. You can change a city, you can shift a city when you start to shift all the agents of society, all the cultural indicators start to move toward the values of the kingdom. And that can only be done by hundreds of people sent into the city, into prisons, into schools, into business, into the arts, into education. Not withdrawn from, but sent into, to be salt and light in that place. And a city the size of Omaha, with this kind of level of connections and networking and partnership, and ideally a network which will grow further and further, I think you got a shot at it. I think you could actually be a real example to the rest of this country of what it looks like for us to really see that kind of shift happen. Because your country needs it, doesn't it? God help you, you got another election coming up. Same as the last one. Does it feel like you're just going round and round in circles? Does it feel like this country's stuck? I'm an outsider and it looks that way. So help to unstick it. Introduce people to the reign of God and let the wild spirit of Jesus transform the world of which you're part. Grace and peace to you, my friends. Bless you.